Welcome to our channel, where the stories of people from different eras and professions come to life. We are in magnificent Ephesus, right by the sea, where the great temple of Artemis reaches toward the heavens and ships from all over the world fill the harbor. Subscribe, and after listening, be sure to share your impressions in the comments. Our story is dedicated to one such man. He has no name in the beginning, because a name is just a sound, while the road itself matters far more. He was born on the shore, among fishing nets and salty winds, but his path led him ever deeper into the heart of foreign lands. He was a stranger to the Persians and a stranger to the Hellenes, and this very fact made his gaze clearer. Through his eyes we see the dust of caravans, the fury of raids, the cold of mountain nights, and the silence of sea piers. Think about what a person becomes when he walks his whole life along a road longer than any war, when his hands hold both weapons and healing herbs, when every encounter and every step holds a choice: to wound or to heal, to stay or to move on. This will not be a legend of heroes glorified in temples. It is the story of a man whose strength lay not in victorious cries, but in his stubborn ability to live despite everything. There will be no eternal shine of glory here, but there will be the smells of food in cheap taverns, the weight of coins in a pocket, the groan of the sick, and the whisper of waves calling home. The boy was born on the Ionian shore, among fishing nets and salty winds. For a child, everything around seemed enormous and new. Pebbles on the beach were entire worlds. His father's boat was a ship of the gods, and the smell of fish and resin was the breath of the sea itself. Elias was still too small to understand the weight of adult worries, but he already knew that bread did not come easily, and fish did not jump into the nets by themselves. His father would leave in the boat and return sometimes with silver fish gleaming in the nets, and sometimes with empty hands when the sea was angry. Then his mother would sit silently at her spinning wheel, and joy would fade from the house. The boy listened to the stories of the elders by the fires. They spoke of ancient creatures living in the depths of the sea, older than humans. If you angered Poseidon, the waves would swallow a boat like a drop of rain. In the darkness, children were afraid to step beyond the torchlight. Even the village healer's bundle of herbs seemed magical to young Elias. He watched the healer apply leaves to wounds and heard the grateful words of adults as if a miracle had occurred. These scenes fascinated him more than tales of war. Perhaps that was when the first spark was born in his heart, not only to run after glory and the sword, but to save lives when they hung by a thread. Days in Ionia smelled of salt and hearth smoke. Children ran barefoot on hot sand, caught crabs among the rocks, and argued over clay balls and pieces of bread. Every small thing felt like a twist of fate. An extra slice of bread was a holiday. Extra sunshine on harvest day was luck. The perspectives for the future were simple then. Boys usually went to the oars, to a craft, or sought the path of the sword. Few thought of more. But Elias, even without realizing it, absorbed the sounds of the port city. The clink of coins, the cries of merchants, the accents of foreigners, All this awakened in him a dream to see farther than his neighbor with the boat. Sometimes the boy would climb to the cliff and gaze where the sea and sky met in one thin line. His eyes squinted from the light, and his heart tightened with a strange feeling that everything real was there, beyond the horizon. This is how nameless desires are born, that later guide a person along the entire road. Of course, childhood was not without trials. One year, a storm broke his father's old boat and threw it onto the rocks. For a whole week, the family lived in hardship. His mother exchanged cloth for grain with neighbors, and the boy listened as adults whispered that the wrath of the gods had come. He saw his father's tired face and the new wrinkles carved deeper by nights of worry. This first blow showed the child that the sea could be not only a friend, but also a merciless judge. Yet there were also holidays. The Ionians loved merriment, songs with flutes, round dances around bonfires. Elias jumped over the fire with his peers, skillfully imitating the elders. On such days, he forgot about poverty, storms, and fear of darkness. Customs accompanied all sides of life. Mornings began with small offerings to the spirits of the hearth. Evenings on the shore, they lit fires, asking protection from the sea element. The boy saw how seriously adults treated these simple actions, as if everything depended on them. He had not yet known philosophy, but he felt that in this world, every grain and every spark mattered. One day, his father returned, tired, and called his son to help. The nets were torn, hands bloody from sharp fins. Elias silently handed him a piece of cloth and, remembering the healer, applied leaves to the wound. His father smiled and said quietly, "You will see farther than I." This was the first time the child felt that his small knowledge could change something in the difficult world of adults. In simple gestures and trembling hands before blood lay the future that would later lead him on campaigns into foreign lands and into the heart of battles. But that was all still ahead. Meanwhile, he remained a boy on the Ionian shore, barefoot, with eyes fixed on the horizon. Between poverty and holiday, between fear and dream, his childhood passed. It was soaked in the smells of fish, clay, and wool, yet it already held something that did not let the soul fade. Quiet hope. Hope that one day the road would lead him to a place where the sea never rages and people are grateful for a helping hand. The narrow streets of the Ionian city filled with noise during the day, which to the teenager sounded like real music. The ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, merchants' cries, the clatter of looms, and the dull beats calling people to the market merged into a continuous hum. In this world he grew up, no longer a child, but not yet a man. At first he helped wherever needed, carrying nets for his father, fetching water for his mother. But gradually, life revealed another calling to him, helping the local healer. The healer was a lean old man with a sparse grey beard who always smelled of dried herbs. The teenager ran with him into the hills to gather leaves and roots. Ordinary plants in the healer's hands became a means that could raise the sick or at least ease the suffering of the dying. The young apprentice did not always understand how it worked, but his heart rejoiced when, thanks to his efforts, gratitude appeared on the faces of the patient's parents. In a small town where everything was measured by bread and fish, people began to speak of the boy who could stop the flow of blood or reduce a fever. This was not fame, but it carried a hint. He could be someone people needed no less than a warrior. Although his friends teased him, calling him the herb apprentice, a proud feeling grew in his soul, not for himself, but for the fact that his hands held at least a little power over fate. The city markets opened his eyes to foreigners, Carians, Lydians, and rare Persians. They walked the same streets in colorful cloaks with earrings and bracelets, arguing with Ionian traders over the price of wine or oil. While helping the healer, Elias listened to their voices, picked up foreign words, and this awakened in him an irresistible desire to be where nations mixed and 10 different speeches could be heard behind one door. His family's social position remained modest. The house was low and cramped, with a clay floor and reed roof. Food was not always enough. Sometimes, his mother spun longer than usual to exchange for a piece of cheese or a handful of olives. Elias understood that in their world, the gap between rich and poor was insurmountable. He saw the houses of the wealthy only from the outside. High walls, carved gates, guards at the entrance. Yet these walls did not arouse envy in him. It seemed that behind them hid a heaviness that tired the rich no less than the poor. Superstitions, as in childhood, intertwined with everyday life. When the healer sent him to gather herbs at dawn, he would whisper, "So that the sun is not offended, touch the leaves cleanly." The young man remembered this not as a prayer, but as a reminder to respect the world in every detail. In his soul, a dream was ripening. He understood he could not remain forever in the shadow of the old healer. The young are drawn to the road. When ships entered the port, he caught every silhouette and listened to sailor stories about warriors, kings, and richly dressed fighters who received silver instead of fish. His heart raced. Should he join the ranks of spearmen like other boys, or build his life as a healer, bringing relief to people? The old healer noticed this inner struggle and once told him, "You are seeking roads, and the road itself will come to you. Just do not argue with it." Elias did not fully understand these words then, but they sank deep inside him like a quiet warning. Perhaps they became the thread that later led him to Persian camps and foreign lands. Sometimes, fate tests a person with small events that later seem important. Once, when his friend cut himself on a rusty spear during play, Elias did not panic. He applied leaves mixed with wine to stop the bleeding. The friend first laughed, but the next day thanked him because the wound did not inflame. From that moment, his peers looked at him differently. No one called him just an apprentice anymore. Small rumors spread through the streets, giving him his first real weight in the eyes of the neighbors. The years of adolescence passed under the creak of his mother's loom, the invisible burdens of his fisherman father, and the rustle of herbs in the healer's hands. At night, he often stared into the darkness where the guards' bonfires flickered by the walls, and wondered what awaited him beyond the horizon. At 18, youthful dreams began turning into decisions. Elias already knew the price of bread, labor, and human pain. He had learned to stop bleeding, reduce fever, and support hope. But the road called him stronger than ever. The city was restless under Persian rule, and every boy heard stories of warriors, satraps, and gold that flowed into the hands of mercenaries. Experienced fighters returned from campaigns with silver belts, scars, and foreign rings. They sat in taverns, laughed loudly, and told tales of battles. For Elias, who had just crossed the line of childhood, this sounded like a call. One day, a group of Persian recruiters arrived in the city. They were looking for young men to serve as mercenaries, guarding caravans and joining military campaigns. The recruiters were clever. They promised shining silver, new lands, and a life worthy of a hero. A crowd of youths pressed around them, eagerly catching every word. Among those faces was Elias. The old healer tried to hold his apprentice back. "You can bring benefit here. Their blood and death await you." But the young man replied passionately, "If I do not go, I will never know why I was given these hands, only to treat fishermen's colds or to save lives where war tears everyone apart without distinction." The healer only sighed. The servant of herbs chose the road of both sword and medicine at once. The decision became a turning point. He was accepted not so much as a warrior, but as a healer for the detachment. The Persians knew how to value useful knowledge. The young Ionian received a place among the warriors, but his hands held not only spear and shield, but also a bag of herbs. His first campaign was anxious. The night before departure, he barely slept. He remembered his mother at the spinning wheel and his father's words, "Live, just live and return." Morning met him with the stamping of hooves, thunder of voices, and the smell of horse sweat. He felt clearly, there is no way back now. The road led through fields and stony plains. Warriors spoke of future booty, argued about women, and sang rude songs. Elias walked a little apart, staying close to the packs where he kept his healing supplies. He did not rush to the front ranks. His weapon was knowledge that could become salvation when the spear line broke from wounds. A case tested him already in the first days. One of the warriors slipped on a rock and slashed his leg badly. The others laughed, calling him unlucky for falling before battle. But Elias quickly removed the man's footwear, washed the wound with wine, and applied healing leaves. The murmur in the ranks shifted. An hour earlier, he had been just a newcomer. Now people whispered, "This Ionian knows how to stop blood." However, the first real fear came later, when the detachment stumbled upon a ravaged village. Burned houses, dead dogs, women fleeing with children. The warriors accepted it as normal, but Elias could not tear his eyes away. For the first time, he saw war not as a legend, but as smoking ashes of human lives. That evening, he ate nothing. And at night, when cries rang out because a captive tried to escape, he sat with his face in his hands. It was hard for him to breathe at the thought that he was now among those who walked through foreign land, where joy was replaced by ashes. Yet he continued onward, not out of thirst for booty or pride, but because the road had already pulled him in. He could no longer return to the bay as a simple healer. In the evenings, by the campfire, he sometimes spoke with the others. They listened not for talk of herbs, but for the simple words with which he could bring a little calm. Gradually, he realized that the mercenaries accepted him, even though they considered him a foreign Hellene. This did not burden him. Deep inside he knew, being a stranger is not scary. It is scarier to be needed by no one. Thus began his adult life, not in the silence of a workshop, but among the whisper of herbs and the clang of weapons under Persian banners. Although fear still lived in his heart, a quiet fire glowed within him. Let the road be hard, but every drop of his knowledge and every attempt to heal would be a stubborn answer to war. At the age of 20, the road for Elias had already ceased to be just a call of dreams. It became an everyday part of existence. war was not the heroic tale whispered by drunken warriors in Ionian taverns. It consisted of rapid marches, dust, shouts, donkeys, and endless roads. He was assigned to guard caravans. A mercenary with a healer's hands had his own special place. He could both raise a spear and save a life. Imagine a caravan on the long road, a long line of camels and mules loaded with sacks of grain, leather, and amphorae of oil. Merchants in colorful clothes glanced warily at the sky, cursed while adjusting packs, and argued about weights. Nearby marched warriors, sweaty and tired, yet always tense. Every bush could hide raiders. The rhythm of steps, the crunch of stones under sandals, and rare shouts of drovers became the music of his new adult life. In his very first caravan journey, Elias felt the special duality of his position. The caravan men looked at him with hope. His hands were needed. The mercenaries respected him cautiously, but no longer laughed when he fussed with bandages or ointments. They knew that without him, many would bleed to death or rot from infection. Once, in a dry, dusty gorge, the caravan was attacked by nomads. The clash was short but fierce. Arrows whistled. The screech of blades sounded like grinding millstones. Elias first rushed to his spear, but soon saw a fallen comrade with a pierced arm. Instinct overcame the roar of battle. He quickly pulled out the arrow, bandaged the wound with cloth, and then raised his weapon again. This duality, sword and herb knife at the same time, became the essence of his road. After the battle, Elias stayed longer than anyone else, treating wounds, applying leaves, and bringing water to the injured. Those who had just heard the echo of arrows now looked at him as a savior. When the caravan safely reached the city, one of the merchants silently handed him a silver coin and added, "You saved not only us, but our goods. Thank you for that." For the young Ionian, this coin became his first real reward. He held it in his palm and felt a different kind of weight, not like bread or fish. This silver could send a gift home to his mother, buy new tools, or give confidence in the coming day. That night, he first realized that money was not only wealth, but also a new form of freedom. Yet the world remained harsh. Caravans knew no rest, and their path led through steppes, rocks, and endless plains. Sometimes for weeks they saw no settlements, only dry grass and fine sand underfoot. At night around the campfire, the warriors ate bread dipped in sour wine and shared stories of raids, women, or miraculous escapes. Elias spoke little. His words were in the bandages, herbal infusions, and careful touches to wounds. He rarely spoke, but more and more often, grateful faces answered him. Although the days passed under the sign of fatigue, a spark still glowed in his heart. He sent part of his earned coins home to Ionia. His father wrote back in short, rough words that the boat was back on the water and the fish were returning to the nets. For Elias, this meant more than any Persian gifts. His road had already become support for those left behind in the native bay. And yet, war always walked beside him. In one caravan journey, a disease broke out. First came tears and cough, then sharp fever. Several men died before noon, and fear stronger than enemy arrows gripped the whole detachment. Elias found himself between the abyss and hope. He gathered wormwood and other bitter herbs, steeped them in water, and made the men drink. Some the illness did not spare, but many endured. For the first time, words were heard. This Hellene saved more of us than the gods. The world around him opened not only through warriors and merchants. He began to notice shades of the east, red fabrics in the markets, the sharp smell of spices, the bitterness of wild wine. The majestic city gates of the Persians seemed to him real gates to another world, where poverty and wealth stood too close. He understood more and more clearly. Here, among strangers, he would become someone he could not have become in the narrow bay of his childhood. But everything had its price. One wounded comrade did not live to the next stop. Elias held his head as the breathing faded, and for the first time sharply realized that not every life could be held in his hands. This knowledge cut deeper than any arrow. The warriors silently buried their friend in the sand, and only Elias, after counting the steps, quietly placed herbs beside him. Let the earth accept them as a gift. Guarding caravans became his school. He learned not only military matters, but also the ability to be useful in any trouble. Caravans moved forward, cities gave way to deserts, and he himself, imperceptibly, step by step, left behind the boy from the bay. In his place stood a young man who understood the price of life, pain, and silver. The road changed his step. Now he walked confidently, without the former youthful stiffness. 2 years of service among caravans and mercenary detachments hardened his body and heart. But most importantly, they opened before him the world of camps. Those strange places where the life of warriors resembled a separate city without walls or houses. The camp always began with noise. First, stakes were driven in, ropes stretched, tents set up, pots, braziers, thrown goat bones, shouts, the splash of wine in jugs, laughter, and swearing immediately appeared on the ground. All this mixed with the smell of smoke and trampled grass. To a stranger, life in the camp seemed chaos, but Elias quickly understood that this chaos had its own laws. Each detachment kept together. Everyone had their own dice, their own songs, and even their own superstitions. Imagine hundreds of people speaking different languages, sleeping side by side, sharing bread and wine, yet each remaining himself. War creates a common brotherhood, but deep in the heart, everyone thinks only of himself and those he loves at home. Elias often watched experienced warriors sitting by the fire, staring silently into the flames, as if listening to the soundless voice of their own memories. He himself, out of habit, kept somewhat apart. It was not pride or coldness that moved him, but the habit of seeing others' pain closer than the roll of dice. He more often bent over wounds than over a cup of wine. His hand reached for bandages rather than gambling stones. The main trouble came not from arrows or swords. The summer was hot, and an epidemic struck the camp. First weakness, then yellow trembling, fever that brought a man to unconsciousness. The warriors were afraid, as if it were the plague itself. Some covered their faces with cloth, others prayed. Someone burned incense to keep evil spirits away. But the disease moved from tent to tent, not distinguishing rich from poor. Elias understood. Here was his real test. No shield would help, no spear would stop this trouble. He mixed decoctions, boiled water, carried bundles of wormwood and juniper, and burned them to drive the infection from the tents. People looked at him with pleading eyes. He did not sleep for days. His shoulders sagged from exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. Yet, the road does not always spare a man. He had a comrade, a young warrior from Phocaea, with whom he often shared bread and conversations about the sea. That friend fell ill among the first. Elias held his hand, tried to give him bitter infusions, cooled his forehead with wet cloths, but the disease proved stronger. On the last night, the warrior looked at him with clouded eyes and whispered hoarsely, "You will return home, but I am already there." Then his breathing stopped. Fear, anger, helplessness, everything clenched in Elias's heart. He stood over his friend's body and felt that for the first time he had truly lost. In that moment he understood. His knowledge was valuable, but not all-powerful. And yet in the morning, despite the pain, he continued trying to save the sick in the camp, sometimes holding life for only a few extra days. The camp changed. Where yesterday there had been noise, now there were only funeral fires, silent songs, and hushed arguments. Even gambling stopped. People feared a drop of water, the whisper of wind, any sneeze. Rumor spread that the disease was divine punishment for plunder. Warriors made offerings, throwing bread and pieces of metal into the fire, but fear did not leave. In this silence, Elias felt the road changing him. He no longer dreamed of silver and glory, although the money still went home to his family. He began to understand that his life was now tied not to the sword, but to what he could do where others were powerless. Try to see this in the eyes of those he healed. Even the stern, bearded mercenaries looked at the young Hellene with a kind of childlike gratitude. And although he remained a stranger, more and more often among them sounded the words, "If I fall, call him." The road, camp after camp, became a school of hard maturity. There was little light in it. A mug of cheap wine, a crumb of bread, the rare sound of laughter. But there was also something that strengthened the heart. The knowledge that although life cannot always be held, the attempt itself is already resistance to a cruel world. In the evenings, he sat aside, looking at the campfires, and there between the flames, he more and more often heard the whisper of past dreams. The sea-scented shore, his mother's laughter, his father's tired hands. Thoughts returned to Ionia, but he already understood that the road had captured him and would not let go. He first sharply realized, this road has no short path. It is longer than any war, longer than any campaign. There will be losses in it, and there will be salvations. Just hold on and hope that somewhere at the end of the path there will be a place where one can finally stop. With the years, Elias's face became more stern, his shoulders stronger, and his gaze learned not to get lost in the noise of wars. After the hard time of the epidemic and sleepless nights in the camps, people close to the satrap noticed him. Rumors about the healer Mercenary, who could hold back death even in the most hopeless cases, had already spread among the warriors. When those who valued life noticed him, regardless of whether the man was Hellene or Persian, Elias found himself at the court of one of the military rulers of the satrapy. Imagine the contrast. Yesterday, dirty tents, smoke, campfires and murky wine. The next day, halls where carpets covered the floors, walls shone with red stone, and the air was filled with incense. He walked through these chambers with distrust in his heart. everything around seemed filled with idle excess. Dishes of meat, sweets, cups of thick wine. But not for a moment did he feel at home in this world. The satrap, tall and important, rarely spoke to him directly, but one incident changed his position. During an inspection of an outer garrison, one Persian commander fell from his horse and broke his leg. Elias was nearby. In front of the warriors, he quickly set the bone, applied splints, and insisted the wounded man be carried into the shade. Surprise spread around. A simple Helen was doing what the rich court's own healers had not dared. When, after several weeks, the commander could stand again, the satrap for the first time summoned the young mercenary to himself. Those who lived at the court treated him with caution. He was neither slave nor noble guest, nor full warrior, but something in between. He wore a simple chlamys and spoke a language that sounded foreign amid the palace splendor. Yet his hands earned respect. Noble people knew that if a cry of illness sounded in the house, this young man would come and do what was needed. Still, the difference between the worlds struck his heart. Light fabrics of rich robes, heavy jewelry on women's wrists, smiles of courtiers. All this was within sight, but beyond his reach. Often at meals for the favored, he received a piece of bread and sour milk, sitting in the corner, while others greedily tore apart roasted birds. He did not envy them, but he felt the full gulf between those who decided fates and those who only served life. Every new day revealed different sides of Persian power to him. The satrap had dozens of officials, scribes, guards, grooms, eunuchs, and servants, and each lived in his own little world. An atmosphere of constant rivalry hung in the walls. Some served for wealth, others for fear, and some simply for the chance to be near power. Elias, a stranger in all this, perceived what was happening as a strange play. It seemed to him that everyone was playing a role that was too important, too loud, too ingratiating. But next to the splendor, there was always the shadow of instability. The satrap feared conspiracies, and constant caution was visible on his face. Then Elias realized, even those who possess wealth sleep without finding peace. They have more food and fabrics, but no more confidence. At some point, he suddenly understood that the despair of the poor and the anxiety of the rulers are different clothes of the same essence. A person is always afraid of tomorrow. However, service at the satrap's court gave him the opportunity to touch knowledge he would never have known otherwise. At the court, there were scrolls about herbs, medicines, and rare potions from distant lands. He could not read Persian, but he watched the actions of the doctors, adopted techniques, and tried new combinations. It was like a new breath for his craft. He combined the simple Ionian school of his childhood with the methods of Eastern medicine. But his dreams remained the same. At night, he saw the sea, the shore, remembered the smell of fish and the laughter of childhood by the fires. Life at the satrap's court did not have that salty breath. Here, everything was decided by gold and power, not by tides and winds. And from time to time, he asked himself whether he was losing his soul among the carpets and stone palaces. Warriors at the court treated him cautiously. They remembered him from the field roads. In private conversations, they called him not just a healer, but a hand that both heals and fights. And although his voice rarely sounded loud, everyone understood that without him the road was longer and more dangerous. This part of life showed him another face of power. Wealth and fear lived as closely as poverty and humility in the Ionian Bay. And although he was no longer the barefoot boy who once looked at the horizon, he still felt like a wanderer. Here, in the painted halls, he remained a stranger. His path was nearby, but not inside. And in this lay the seed of understanding. The road always leads not only forward across the earth, but also inward into the soul. Among luxury and foreign power, he first realized that true strength lies not in gold or ranks, but in a simple hand that can hold another's life when everything else is collapsing. Changes always happen suddenly, like wind unfurling a sail. He was ordered to go with a military convoy deep into Persia. The satrap did not fully trust strangers, but he had grown too fond of having beside him the one whose hands could pull the heaviest sick from death's grasp. And so Elias, accustomed to seashores, stepped onto the path that took him far beyond familiar horizons, to where the air smelled not of salt, but of the dust of dry plains. The familiar noise of waves disappeared. Now mornings began with wind carrying sand. Evenings rang with the chirping of grasshoppers and the distant howl of jackals at night. For a man born by water, every absence of the sea felt like torment. Endless sky, endless land, and no smell of salt, no gleam of waves, only grey-yellow expanse where the eye could find no anchor. Longing entered his dreams. There, among the campfires and guttural voices of Persian warriors, he saw his childhood. His mother at the loom, his father with the nets, the ropes of the boat smelling of resin. Waking up, he felt bitterness in his mouth. Memory made his heart heavier than any burden. And yet, the road called. He already knew the price of losses, had seen the death of comrades, but he walked on because the road left no choice. The convoy moved slowly. Camels heavily shifted their legs. Wheels creaked on carts. People argued about taxes, grain, and tribute. He treated them on the go, bandaged calluses here, applied herbs to a swelling there, comforted someone after a snake bite. For simple soldiers, his work meant no less than protection. But one day, the road gave him a meeting that changed his thoughts more than the experience of bloody camps. During a halt among lonely hills, he noticed a wanderer. The man walked with a staff in a simple cloak, without weapons, with a leather bag on his back. He spoke in a language that carried the pure sounds of Ionia, soft and familiar. For Elias, it was like suddenly hearing a native melody in a foreign land. The wanderer turned out to be a traveling philosopher, one of those who left their native cities in search of knowledge and disciples. The warriors laughed at him. What use are words when the enemy is near? But Elias did not push him away. In the evening, they sat by the fire and talked for a long time. The philosopher said, "The road is not only a path for the feet, but also a path for thoughts. The goal is always vague, but the path reveals a person to himself." These words cut deeper than any scar. Elias listened silently, as if seeing a reflection of his own thoughts for the first time. He had long felt that the road was longer than war itself. But to hear it from the wise man gave meaning to his sufferings. Imagine how easy it was to believe a man without weapons among warriors. There was no threat or greed in his voice. He spoke of every step being a gift, and every loss a trial that helps one see oneself more clearly. Suddenly, it became clear. Even in foreign lands, even separated from the sea, he was not alone. There was someone walking the same paths of thought. The next day, the philosopher went on his way, leaving only the words, "Never seek the end of the road. Seek its continuation." Elias looked after him for a long time, until the figure disappeared behind the hills. In his heart remained a strange calm, neither joy nor sadness, but something in between. It was as if a quiet confidence had opened inside him, that to keep walking forward was already victory in itself. Meanwhile, life under Persian banners went on as usual. People in the convoy did not notice philosophical thoughts. They were troubled by the price of grain, illnesses of camels, heat and fatigue. But Elias now saw something greater in this. Life revealed itself in small things. In the smile of a sick man who could stand again. In a stream of water from a rare spring. In the shade of a tent under the blazing sun. The world of the East opened wider. He saw cities in the steppe, fortified walls, bazaars selling carpets and spices, faces with features completely unlike his own. He understood that he was not destined to stay here forever, but every picture became part of his road. In the evenings, he returned again and again to the words of the wandering sage, and gradually his own fears, the fear of perishing in a foreign land, the fear of forgetting his native shore, began to soften. For if the road itself has meaning, then every day, even the bitter one, still contains a grain of future joy. Only sometimes the longing rose sharply, like a knife. The wind brought the smell of dry earth, and he thought, but the native air smells of salt and wet wood. Longing for the sea did not let go, but now he knew that ahead there would still be transitions, there would still be meetings, and for now his steps belonged to the land of Persia, hot, distant, dusty, but as alive as Ionia. This part of the path made him older than his years. In his early 20s, he already knew the price of blood, the price of cold in the soul, and the price of a word spoken at the right moment. And most importantly, he began to understand that life is not measured only by victories and silver. It is measured by steps along the road that constantly calls forward. When the road led the convoy to the mountains, the air changed. After the heat of the plains, a cold wind struck the face like an alien force. It seemed the land itself here was hostile to man. Steep paths, stones crumbling underfoot, a night that descended without warning. For a man born by the sea and a healer by calling, this was a test of a completely different kind. In the mountains, everything sounded different. Even footsteps became dull. Echo repeated every sound, and the wind stretched cold fingers toward the warrior and wanderer. People in the detachment, accustomed to steps, grumbled, "Here even breathing costs more." Soldiers wrapped fabrics over their cloaks, lit fires even before sunset, but the cold still bit into the bones. Elias saw how even the strongest had trembling hands. These lands obeyed only themselves. The Persians led the detachment on a campaign against tribes that did not submit to the satrap's power. Stone huts on the slopes, thin streams of smoke, dogs barking. All this opened to the travelers through a veil of fog. The tribes lived harshly, and the war with them was not so much open battle as a chain of sudden raids. Elias first encountered a different kind of fear. On the plains, the enemy was visible, furious, noisy, with cries and whistling arrows. In the mountains, death was invisible. You step on a path and a stone flies from above. A comrade walks beside you and suddenly disappears into the abyss. You hear only the ringing of stones, and you already understand that life is no more. In the evenings, the campfires in the camp did not warm. People huddled closer to them, passed skins to each other, and in their eyes one could read not only cold, but also weariness from constant anxiety. Elias sat by the fire, treated cuts, rubbed hands with ointments for joint pain, but he himself felt that for the first time the cold had reached not only the body, but also the heart. Try to feel that night when you hear the howl of the wind and imagine that a step into the darkness may be the last. He became afraid of dying in obscurity, not in battle, where at least his name would slip from a comrade's lips, but here, where the mountains would swallow the body and no one would know where his grave lay. This feeling cut deep into him. He understood that the worst thing is not death itself, but death that no heart will remember. And yet the road demanded to keep going. He helped the wounded as before, cut hot wounds, washed them with warm wine, laid people on skins. Sometimes he even had to treat locals taken captive. The warriors looked at him with contempt, but he explained, "If you let a prisoner die, tomorrow he will become a shadow in our dreams." Not everyone agreed, but many remained silent. One dawn, the detachment fell into an ambush. Stones crashed down from above. Arrows pierced the front ranks. Panic spread instantly. Elias rushed to help the fallen. But a stone slipped near his feet, struck him and knocked him to the ground. Sparks flashed in his eyes, cold pierced his chest. Lying there, he thought for the first time, "This is it. I will remain here." But fate spared him. The stone only tore the fabric, leaving a deep bruise. People lifted him up, and he returned to the bandages, gritting his teeth. That night became a turning point. Sitting by the campfire, he trembled, not from cold, but from the thought that he had been one step from a nameless end. Wine burned his throat, but did not warm him. Then he remembered the philosopher's words, "Do not seek the end of the road, seek its continuation." And suddenly he felt, even the fear of death is part of the path. One can surrender to it, or one can turn this fear into strength that forces one to keep walking. The mountains stretched for weeks. Stone paths, voices of enemies disappearing among the rocks, rare villages where people looked at them with hatred for a bowl of milk. Gradually, he got used to it. Fear did not disappear, but turned into caution. Every movement became attentive, every step measured. His soul learned to accept into the road not only joy, but also the silent threat of emptiness. In this lay a new maturity. He stopped waiting for victorious songs from life. He realized that the life of a mercenary is not laurels and solemn processions. It is the silence of cold nights, sparks of campfires, and the rare smile of someone you pulled from the claws of death. When the convoy finally emerged from the mountains, it seemed to Elias that he had thrown off a huge weight from his shoulders. Below lay the plain, and in the distance houses could be seen. People rejoiced, laughed, even cried with relief. He walked with a stone inside that would remain with him forever. This stone became a reminder. His path was not about glory, but about movement. And if life measures out to each a share of the road, then his share would always be longer, heavier, but also more significant. Having survived the cold of the mountains, he learned to value every flame and every drop of warmth. When the mountains were left behind, and the caravan, together with the troops, returned to the rich Persian lands, the mercenaries awaited their pay. The hum in the camp was special. Conversations were no longer about fear and cold, but about fatty meat, nights in taverns, and new purchases. For many, war's payment became the only proof that their road had at least some meaning. Elias received his share of silver. The coins shone in his hands and seemed heavy, as if each contained not only metal, but the weight of all the nights endured, losses and fear. He looked at them and suddenly understood. This is not just payment, this is memory. Every coin was connected with the face of a fallen comrade, with the tormented paths, with scars on the body. For the first time, he had the opportunity to live differently, at least for a short time. The detachment was allowed to disband in one of the large eastern cities. The world suddenly unfolded in bright colors. Street flutes, women in colorful veils, merchants spreading fabrics so that bright patterns shimmered in the sun. The cities of the East breathed with noise and the breath of people, and this overwhelmed the one who had recently sat on a cold mountain rock. Imagine, after weeks of cold and dust, hot baths with steam, wine, sweet fruits, soft fabrics. He sat in a house where carpets with patterns hung on the walls and food stood on the table in such quantity that it would have sufficed for 7 families from his native bay. All this spun and at the same time clouded the mind. Too quickly the heart felt itself a guest, but not the master. This luxury was fleeting, too foreign to become part of him. He spent the silver carefully. He bought a new, thicker cloak, so as not to freeze during night marches. He acquired a good knife to replace the old one lost in the mountains. He kept the rest hidden securely. The silver he held as both memory and a promise that part of these gifts could be sent back to Ionia. Thoughts returned to home more and more often. Buy land near the shore, plant grapes, build a small house, he fantasized. The dream of his own home became clearer. But the city gave not only wealth, it opened new pictures of alien life. Here, women did not walk openly, but hid behind house curtains. The market began before dawn and did not fall silent until deep night. Gold glittered in the hands of the nobility, while the poor lay at the gates. Elias again felt how the world divides into those who eat in excess and those who make do with a crust of bread. and wine did not dull the longing. Sitting by the window in the banquet hall, he suddenly felt suffocated, as if all the carpets and cups were pressing on his chest. Then he understood. His joy was not here. He was a guest in this world, and even if the silver stayed in his hands for a while, his heart would still reach for the sea, for the salt of the wind, for the fisherman's boat, for the smell of wet clay after rain. One day in the city, an event occurred that stayed in his memory. At night, a fire broke out in the trading rows. Cries were heard far away. Flames rose into the sky. Warriors and ordinary residents rushed to extinguish it, but panic grew. Elias found himself among those helping to pull out the wounded. In the smoke he dragged out a boy and a woman, burned but alive. And in the morning, when the residents were again setting up tents among the charred logs, an old man approached him and said, "You are a stranger, but that night you were one of us." These words warmed him more than wine and silver. In that moment, he understood that true wealth is not a heavy pouch, but the memory in people's hearts.